Great. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to this webinar today. I'll offer just an orientation in terms of the flow for our program, but I wonder as we begin, it would help our speed immensely if in addition to muting your mics, for those who are not presenting, if it is possible to please turn off your webcam, that would be very helpful. Thank you very much. So good morning. As you've heard, my name is Adele Halliday, and I work at the National Office of the United Church of Canada, and there I serve as a team leader for discipleship and witness. And we are delighted at the United Church to be working with the World Council of Churches in co-presenting this webinar. And there are 4 presenters who will be offering insights this morning. They are Nestor Medina, Peter Notaboom,
Angelique Walker-Smith,
Kofi Hope, and Carol Duncan. In terms of flow this morning, we'll begin with an opening prayer. And in our first session, we'll hear from one speaker and then a second speaker, and then there'll be some time for questions about those from those first 2 speakers. Then we'll hear from the last 2 speakers and also some time of questions. In order to ask a question, we would invite you using the group chat that's on the right-hand side of your screen. If you're able to type your questions as we go along, that would be the easiest, and your presenters will be able to see that and pose those. So when it's time for the questions, we can easily respond to those. So thank you very much for that, and we look forward to our conversations. So I wonder if we might begin with a time of prayer. This is an opening prayer that comes from a resource called Sankofa. It's the Histories and Heritages of Black Peoples in the United Church of Canada. It's a video and DVD resource. And this is an opening prayer that was written by one of our contributors. So let us pray together. O Creator God, how could we not delight in the awesome abundance, creativity, diversity, and joy you provide for all creation. You have been faithful through all generations of humanity, inviting us to be grasped by your love and imagination. Empowering God, it is you who imagines and wills a world where healing and servant power is privileged over tyrannical and oppressive power. A world where we relish and celebrate the variety of thin and thick lips, of kinky and straight and curly hair, of broad and narrow noses, and a veritable potpourri of skin colors. In a world where the evils of racism, discrimination, and rejection are overcome and replaced by the joys of welcome, hospitality, justice, and peace. Be pleased, O God, to grant us resolve, imagination, grace, and stamina for this wondrous journey of transformation that you call us to do together. And so we will. In the name and way of Jesus we pray. Amen. So our speaker orders this morning. We'll begin with Nestor Medina. Nestor will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes, sharing a little bit about his topic. And his conversation topic today is ethno-racial relations, the emergence of anti-Black racism and connections to the doctrine of discovery. And Nestor is a Latino-Canadian theologian. He's a member of the Pentecostal Church, but he actively works across denominational traditions. And his research focuses on contextual, cultural, and liberation and decolonial theologies. He is a visiting scholar at the Emmanuel College Center for Research in Religion. So welcome to Nestor, and the floor is over to you.
Hi, thanks, Adele. Good morning, everybody. Well, Adele has already said what my task is, so let me begin by saying that in the context of the Americas, anti-Black racism did not emerge independently from other expressions of racialized discrimination. From a historical perspective, racialized attitudes had a complicated development. We can trace the inception of racialized anti-Black sentiments in the Americas to the emergence of European colonization and its accompanying doctrine of discovery. To understand much of today's anti-Black racist attitudes, we need to look back at how European colonization took place and how African people fare in the apparatus of imperialism. Now, I will focus particularly in the context of the Spanish and Portuguese empires and later construction of Blackness in the Spanish colonial societies. And then I will jump ahead just to today's racist attitudes among Latinos and Latinas in Canada. Along the way, I will make allusions on how the doctrine of discovery has had an enormous influence on the way Canada was created as a country and organized as a society. Anyway, I choose to focus on the Spanish and Portuguese sides of the story because they took place before the French and English contingents of colonization in the US and Canada. The Spanish and Portuguese sides of the story help us have a better sense of anti-Black attitudes even today. Now, we all know that it was the Spanish and Portuguese who first brought African slaves to the Americas, turning the slave trade into a profitable venture. There were more African slaves sent to Latin America than to US and even Canada together. In fact, the first Africans to arrive to the Americas came with the conquistadors in 1493 with Columbus. They were called Ladinos because they had been enculturated into Spanish and Portuguese culture. And they aided the Spaniards and the Portuguese in conquering the indigenous communities of today's Latin America. Let me give you a little bit of background. As the Spanish reconquered the Iberian Peninsula in January 1492, a systematic backlash against Africans took place. The reconquest meant the deportation of Muslims and Jews from Spain. As these two groups were being ejected, the Spanish sought to purify society. The goal was not so much to purify the racial stock of Spanish. The consolidated empire of Spain under the Isabela Católica and Fernando de Aragon was a mishmash of many smaller ethnic communities. So the deportation of Muslims and Jews had more to do with religious purification and the protection of the Christian Catholic tradition from being corrupted by these two traditions. It was this set of attitudes that gave birth to the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions in 1478 and 1536 correspondingly. In my studies of the documents from the Inquisition, I have learned that the criteria for declaring someone a heretic included that they be Spanish-born, not Moro, which really meant to be, which the Spanish word for Muslim from primarily an African descent, and an old Christian, which meant not recently converted from either Judaism or Islam. So the documents revealed the primarily religious overtones. But by the time the Spanish arrived to the Americas in 1492, and they were confronted with the indigenous populations, a shift took place. Ethno-racial composition took on a greater role than religious identity. Now, three factors contributed to this shift. The first one is that indigenous people were seen as subhuman or underdeveloped humans in comparison to the Spanish. Violence against them ensued, and many were enslaved and used to exploit the mines, and many others were relocated to other regions to prevent them from rebelling. At the same time, African slaves were being brought over as extra manual labor to work in the mines as domestic help and to help in the farms. So subduing and enslaving these two groups helped establish a sense of racial superiority among the Spanish. The second factor was the religious in nature. To view indigenous and African religious traditions as being of the devil ensure the idea of Christianity as being the superior religion. And three, which to me is the most important factor, is the doctrine of discovery, because it provided the justification for conquering the indigenous and taking their lands, and for enslaving the Africans and imposing Christianity and Spanish and Portuguese cultures on them. In 1550, the Spanish crown convened a council in Salamanca, Spain, to explore whether the Spanish had the right to take the lands of the indigenous communities and to enslave them. The decision was made to recognize their status as human beings, but the Spanish felt still the divine right to invade, colonize, and assimilate the indigenous people because of their claim of discovery. In the case of African slaves, things were a bit more complicated because slavery, that is, the purchasing and selling of fellow Africans, had become a standard practice among some African communities. So the Portuguese expanded it to as the Portuguese expanded to the west coast of Africa around the middle of the 15th century. They also adopted the practice. It became a profitable venture on a massive scale. However, regional African forms of slavery and European expressions of slavery were fundamentally different in their rationale. African forms of slavery were primarily related to war and kidnapping of people from rival tribal groups. But for Europeans, to enslave the Africans and others was an expression of the divine right and entitlement they had by virtue of discovering those lands. So the papal bull paved the way. Pope Nicholas V granted King Duarte of Portugal in 1436 and 1452 the permission to invade and capture Muslims and other unbelievers, by which he meant non-Christians, and to reduce them into perpetual servitude. Enslaving them was understood as being more merciful than killing. These two realities, that is the taking of indigenous lands and destruction of their cultural traditions, and the enslaving of African peoples and their descendants, were seen as a natural result of the original ideas that shaped the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery is important because it marks the point at which a specific human group, that is Western Europeans, began to perceive themselves as racially superior to other ethnocultural groups. We see the after effects in this kind of laws, which were created post-1492 and which regulated Spanish colonial societies. Operating as mechanisms of population control, the laws establish a hierarchical social religion in which white Europeans were able to claim great social, economic, and political privileges. But they drew on existing racialized prejudices towards indigenous blacks and mestizos and mestizas. In terms of African descendants in the black population, the archives that I've studied show laws where black people were unable to carry weapons. 2 or 3 slaves from different masters could not gather in public, and they could not wear clothing that made them look as if they were part of a higher class. Vagrancy laws explicitly spoke of blacks as lazy, drunks, arrogant, and rebellious. The laws also made it impossible to have black Ladinos, as you recall, Ladinos, that's Africans from the Spanish Peninsula, to meet with regular slaves because the black Ladinos had bad customs and could give the African slaves wrong ideas about freedom. The slaves had to be bozales, by which they meant those that were shackled and that came directly from Africa. And they had to be not helofes, which really meant African people from Sudan, because they were Muslims and they were too hard to domesticate. It is fascinating to find so early in the history of the Americas, during the Spanish colonial societies, the laws contributed to the development of a specific anti-black stereotypical ideas and attitudes. A number of social castes were developed, by which people's ancestral lines was determined by the percentage of Spanish, indigenous, and black blood in them. Many people who were able to pass as white or non-black took advantage of that opportunity, but had to sever their ties with their ancestry. The majority, however, were ranked hierarchically according to the variety of hues and tones of pigmentation. The closer to whiteness, the more social privileges they received. A number of castes were created, to be exact, as many as 120, measuring the percentage of African, indigenous, and Spanish blood, and we're organized hierarchically. So let me jump ahead because, you know, this is a historical, but now let me talk a little bit about the present. Among Latin Americans and Latinos in Canada, many of these racialized social markers are still operative. The wars of independence and the end of slavery at the turn of the 19th century did not improve the situation for the Black population. In many of the Latin American countries, to speak of a Black population still is unthinkable. And stereotypical attitudes from the colonial societies have remained intact and unchallenged. Among Latinos in Canada, often there are unrevealed racial prejudicial attitudes towards Black Latinos and Latinas and other members of the Black and African communities. Anyway, as I come to the end of my time before Adele stops me, I want to say that the doctrine of discovery has had many other destructive implications. The doctrine of discovery contributed to normalizing the hierarchical organizations of peoples with African and Blacks at the bottom of the social ladder. It established racial phenotypical markers and skin color as criteria for determining social privileges and social standing, with whites at the top and all other groups below them organized hierarchically. In Canada, in as much as the indigenous communities can be said to be equal co-founders with British and French, the forms of government, Canada's ethnocultural projection abroad, and its treatment of immigrants demonstrate an operative Eurocentric orientation. Among Latinos and Latinas, we can see similar patterns of discrimination. Drawing from my own experience, I can say that Latinos and Latinas are stigmatized as others because of their brown skin, particular cultural traditions and costumes, and the way they speak English. Let me give you a couple of examples. For Latinos who migrate to Canada, but were educated in Latin America, they still have to obtain equivalencies for their education to work in Canada. But other immigrants from European countries are welcome without such requirements. Stereotypes of Latinos and Latinas as illegal, as drug dealers, and as criminals are also ubiquitous in the media. And to have a Latino or Latina name often can prevent one from getting a job. These are ways in which the doctrine of discovery is still operative against the Latino and Latina population. But in the churches as well, if I want to mention them just at the end, the doctrine of discovery also operates by disallowing the leadership, music, culture, and intellectual traditions of Blacks and other ethnic groups by remaining white in its ecclesial ethos and culture. Anyway, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nestor, for that very engaging talk and conversation. Very much appreciated. So for those who have just joined us, that was Nestor Medina, who was speaking about ethno-racial relations, the emergence of anti-Black racism, and the connections to the doctrine of discovery. In a moment, we're going to hear from Carol Duncan, but I would invite those who have newly joined the conversation, if it is possible, if you're not presenting, if you could please turn off your web camera, that would be very helpful. It will also help with our connection speed. So if you're not presenting, if you could turn off your webcam, thank you very much. So we are soon going to hear from Carol Duncan. And Carol is going to be speaking on the topic of Beyond the Underground Railroad, Legacies of Slavery in Canada. Carol is a member of the Anglican Church, and Carol works at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo. There she works as the coordinator of the Women and Gender Studies program, and she is also a professor in the Department of Religion and Culture. So we welcome Carol. And just as a reminder, immediately after Carol, there'll be a time of questions and conversations. So from what you've heard from Nestor and what you've heard from Carol, some time for questions for both those speakers. If you already have a question that is brewing in your mind, please feel free to type that in the group chat. And when it comes time for questions, then we'll pose those. So thank you and welcome to Carol.
Thank you very much, Adele. Thank you to the United Church of Canada and to all of the organizers for the invitation to participate in this discussion. It is my pleasure and an honor to be here. So in talking about African Canadian, Black Canadian experiences and Blackness in Canada beyond the Underground Railroad, I want to comment on two related issues. And the first is the question of why Africans in relationship to their captivity and transportation in the transatlantic slave trade. And the second question is, what is the significance of race as an organizing principle in the colonies of Western Europe and the Americas, including what would eventually become Canada? So let's start with the latter, the significance of race as an organizing principle in colonial expansion of Western Europe. It bears repeating here that there is no biological basis to race. The modern concept of race emerged out of the social meanings attributed to superficial stereotypical differences based on hair texture, skin color, eye color, nose shape, size of lips, and so on. Clearly, race is socially constructed. However, as philosopher and cultural critic Cornel West reminds us in his book of the same name, Race Matters, it matters in its continued impact in shaping how people understand their own identities and their place and role in various communities and social groupings, and their relationships to others and to power in society. The concept of racialization, as introduced by Omi and Winant, is useful here. Omi and Winant defined racialization as the socio-historical process by which racial categories are created, inhabited, transformed, and destroyed. From this perspective, then, race is not a static category, but one which is constantly in flux and perpetually evolving. Race is thus best understood as a social relation of power through which meanings evolve, shift, and change. Systems of public representation in language, music, mass media, including movies, television, the internet, and other forms of digital media are part and parcel of the process of circulation, meaning making, and critique of ideas about race. The concept of race and practices of organizing societies in the Americas based on it were key parts of the apparatus of ruling during the colonial era. Race and empire, as my colleague Nestor Medina has reminded us so eloquently, were intrinsically linked. There's nothing mystical about race and racism in their application. We can see the evolution of these ideas in legal statutes, in pseudoscientific theories, which suggested that humans were inherently different on a hierarchical rank-ordered scale, which placed whiteness at the top and blackness at the bottom. The scholarship of art historian Charmaine Nelson at McGill University shows how these ideas of superiority and inferiority were also reflected in visual cultural representations. It is not an overstatement then to say that the development of what we know as modernity today, that is to say the culture of late capitalism as a global economic system, owes a great deal to race as a central organizing principle in the emergence of the world created by these early moderns. So then the question of why Africans in the relationship of the emergence of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery itself must be addressed as an economic one from which the concept of race served as an ideological justification. Racist ideas were not the cause of enslavement of Africans, but rather lent support to the practice. The issue of labor, and lots of it, to fuel the economies of scale that drove empire was a constant one. Labor was unfree and free, and it was Black, it was white, it was indigenous, it was South Asian and Asian, it was Scottish, Irish, Chinese and Portuguese, Yoruba and Igbo. You get the idea. In other words, forms of unfree labor, including slavery and indentureship, played a part in shaping modern identities, including those formed in resistance. Enslaved African labor then, especially in the form of chattel slavery, in which people are considered commodities, fueled both the large-scale agricultural enterprises such as sugar and its byproducts of rum and molasses in the Caribbean and Brazil during the 17th to 19th centuries, as well as other labor-intensive economies based on rice, cotton, indigo, and mineral extraction. Canada's own documented history of enslavement of Africans began in 1628 with the recorded sale of a young boy named Olivier Le Jeune from Madagascar. It is not to say that the practice of slavery did not begin before 1628. It probably did, but in terms of documented historical artifacts, that date is cited because of the record of sale. Olivier's actual name from his African cultural context is as yet unknown. He was purchased by David Kirk, a British commander at Quebec in colonial New France. Slavery in Canada was not large scale, as in the southern United States, the Caribbean, or areas of Latin America, where the labor of enslaved peoples fueled the economies. It tended to be on a more individual basis, practiced by wealthy households and also by the church in colonial New France and in other colonial territories, including what is Upper Canada or the province of Ontario today. Abolition came in 1834 after important moves to limit slavery, such as the 1807 British ban of the transatlantic slave trade. It also came after consistent rebellion and revolt by enslaved Africans. So it's important to keep in mind that while Canada is often lauded for the Underground Railroad, the 19th century system of safe houses and routes that allowed freedom seekers to successfully escape slavery in the southern United States by taking overland and water-based paths to northern states and territories north of the 49th, it is not without its own legacy of race and racism. Even after the abolition of slavery in 1834, ideas and practices which limited the full participation of formerly enslaved people and their descendants continued to shape their lives for generations. What we experienced in Canada was de facto segregation, segregation by cultural practice, segregation learned across generations, and entrenched in the ways in which communities organized themselves. A review of such incidents as the 1946 incarceration of African-Canadian hairdresser and businesswoman Viola Desmond over challenging segregationist practices by purchasing a ticket in the orchestra section of a theater in New Glasgow, Nova Scotia, points to the pervasiveness of racialized attitudes and their influence on societal norms over a century after slavery had been officially banned. So modern 21st century notions of race have their origins and their roots in this earlier colonial period. Omey and Winant remind us that these attitudes shift and change over time. They bring pieces forward into the current context, even as the meanings and symbols associated with them shift. While Canada has been on a path of inclusive nation building since the 1960s, the legacies of an older version of Canadian nationalism linked to the country's history is a white British settler colony with similar practices and policies such as those in Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa still linger on. Developments such as an official policy of bilingualism, the adaptation of the immigration point system in the mid-60s, which effectively did away with the overt emphasis on so-called cultural criteria, which privileged Northwestern European migrants as most suitable for migration to Canada, all have led towards the opening up of Canadian society. The adaptation of multiculturalism as an official policy of nation building was also a key aspect of redefining nationalism. However, the continued racialized segregation of residential areas, the reporting of discriminatory practices in employment, housing, and other daily aspects of social life point to the persistence of discriminatory patterns as well as their impact on new social realities. Clearly, in my mind, we do not live in a post-racial moment here in Canada, borrowing a term that came into practice after the election of President Barack Obama 10 years ago. While there have been undeniably transformational changes in the post-Second World War era, further dismantling of the systems of inequality based on race are needed. Employing anti-racist frameworks, as sociologist of education George Saifuddeh advocates, is both a discourse and a practice. In other words, it entails both the perspectives which we employ as well as the specific actions and policies shaped by this awareness. In conclusion, I want to note that from my perspective, Canada has a great promise to fulfill as one of the first nations in the modern era to declare that a singular national identity is not a requirement for the organization of societies. This was a relatively radical statement to make in 1971, and one that flew in the face of earlier formulations of nationalism. The fulfillment of that promise, though, requires coming to terms with and challenging the ongoing dual legacy of older forms of nation building, which have their roots in empire, its ideological justification of a naturalized, racialized rank ordering of humanity, the disenfranchisement of Native peoples, and on the other hand, the promise of a truly transformed and open society. So thank you so much for your time to allow me to make these comments, and I look forward to our discussion this morning.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Carol, for that conversation and presentation. And just as a reminder, Carol was speaking about Beyond the Underground Railroad, Legacies of Slavery in Canada. So now is an opportunity to ask questions. We've heard some wonderful historical insights from both Nestor and Carol. There haven't been any questions in the chat so far, but if you would like to ask a question, we can unmute your microphone and you can pose that directly to the presenters. So now's the time for questions, things you're wondering about, things you've heard that may have sparked your imagination. Please feel free to note if you have a question for Carol or Nestor. So
Adele, I wonder if I could ask a question of Nestor. This is Peter.
Yes, please. Mm-hmm.
No, I'm just fascinated, Nestor, by your connection of the doctrine of discovery with Indigenous peoples and people of color or Black people in the Americas. And I wonder if you could just unpack that just a little bit more, how the doctrine of discovery historically connected to those experiences and what that looks like today.
As I was saying, the doctrine of discovery created the blueprint to begin to talk about, or begin to talk in terms of ethno-racial background as kind of criterion for organizing peoples hierarchically. So, though initially had very clear connections to the discovering of people, when the quote-unquote discovering took place, the inability of Europeans to see the other peoples as equals, but rather to see them as either subhumans or just candidates for slavery, that created in their imaginary a certain a certain hierarchy of groups that inevitably took form in more concrete ways in law, for example, or in the social organization of the colonial societies, specifically for me, the Americas, Spanish Americas. That organizing of peoples in hierarchical terms eventually was also incorporated by Europeans as the Enlightenment came out and they began to think about the rest of the world. The initial organizing of the rest of the world in racial terms was not disconnected, or it was not unconnected to the doctrinal discovery or the events that had taken place during the doctrinal discovery. So it is that primary impetus to organize groups hierarchically that impacted, and that is still, we feel the effects in terms of anti-Black racism. We see it quite clearly in many places, the ability to dehumanize members of the African community, or Afro-Canadians, or Black Canadians, or African people from other countries, to deprive them of specific privileges or rights or opportunities, is a way by which we can see, in my view, the doctrinal discovery still operating. The organizing of our society, Canadian society to be specific, in terms of privileges, white people, is not just racist or racialized, but it also has, in my view, deep connections and roots in the events that took place or that came out of the doctrinal discovery.
Yeah, I wonder if I could ask a quick follow-up question, maybe also to you, Carol. One of the gifts of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its call to action to repudiate the doctrine of discovery is that it's arrived on the agenda of churches and other communities. When we think about repudiating the doctrine of discovery, we usually, at least I usually, apply it to indigenous peoples in the Americas. What does it mean to repudiate the doctrine of discovery and its effects on Black peoples in the Americas?
That's a great question. I think a part of it is recognizing that the notion of discovery and the idea of terra nullius, meaning no people on the land, which is part of the ideological framework that supported it, that if we're challenging that we have to kind of rethink what those early encounters were like, not only for indigenous folk and Europeans, but also for the Africans who arrived as a part of the colonizing project. So I think it complicates our view of that historical time period. I think when I think in the Canadian context of Samuel de Champlain, I have to think also of his translator, Mathieu da Costa, as somebody who's a Portuguese-born African, taking part in that early colonialist expansion in the early years of the 1600s as part and parcel of that. So I think the doctrine of discovery complicates the experience of Africans in the Americas as both victims of colonization and as enslaved peoples, but also as part and parcel of the colonialist project from its very early days. I think also it challenges stereotypical notions of recent arrival of peoples of African descent. The peoples of African descent are not a part of or have not been here in the Americas beyond, say, the post-Second World War generation in terms of Canada, for instance. So doctrine of discovery to me opens that up. The other thing is that we have to then think about the application of a similar perspective on the African continent itself, towards the ending of the 19th century, the so-called Scramble for Africa, which takes place from 1885, maybe you could say a couple of decades earlier, but definitely in terms of the last decade and a half of the 19th century, where we have similar kinds of notions of discovery in terms of mineral wealth, in terms of the creation and expansion of Western European empires there as well too. So for me, it's extremely important. It complicates the historical record in some important ways.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for those excellent questions, Peter, and thank you to Carol and Nestor for those responses. We have two additional questions and then, three additional questions, and then we will move on to our next speaker. So the first question in the chat is a relatively simple one, and it's offering thanks and wondering if it might be possible to make the text of the presentations available, if you might be willing to do that. I think that's to both of you, if you'd be willing.
I don't think I'm hearing you, Nestor.
Sorry. Trying to be respectful here. I think if for my sake, this is what I presented today as part of a larger project and research that I still am doing. And so I would be glad to share it if the presentations, all of the presentations today were to be made available in some collected way. Separately, I would rather just wait a little bit until I finish my research.
I would say likewise, but I can also make available some work that is related to this area that is already published, you know, that reviews some of this, some of these ideas, and that is already available.
Oh, right. Sorry, let me add then also, there is a document called On the Doctrine of Discovery that I had the opportunity to write that is on the Canadian Council of Churches website that people can readily purchase and download or purchase in printed form, which kind of deals significantly with this issue of the doctrine of discovery.
Wonderful, thank you for that. The other thing I would note is that this webinar is being recorded, and soon after this we will make the link available in case people would like to view it again. So thank you. So there are two additional questions. One question is one from Meg, noting that she was recently challenged by the suggestion that the 4 colors of the medicine wheel are racist because it names different skin colors, and wondering if you might be able to comment on that. The second question comes from Lydia and other staff colleagues at the United Church offices, wondering if either of you might be able to comment on how to deconstruct the doctrine of discovery in the current context. So if you're able to offer some responses, brief responses to both of those, that would be great, and then we'll hear from our final two speakers. Thank you.
My goodness. This is such a complicated questions and try to respond something briefly, but I am not all too familiar with the medicine wheel in terms of naming skin colors. So I'll rather leave that to Carol if she has something to say about that. In terms of deconstructing the doctrine of discovery in our current context, I'm not entirely sure what is meant by deconstructing. I think there is something to be said about the significant difficulty in thinking of the notion of discovery. And a lot of indigenous communities have appealed to the papacy to repudiate the notion of discovery as well. And the papacy so far hasn't done it. So in that sense, that's one way we can do it. On the other hand, just to imagine the doctrine of discovery not as a one moment in time, or not just merely a document, but a whole network of ideas and attitudes and the stereotypical notions, and to begin to see those as totally going in a direction in which dehumanizes our fellow, in this case, our fellow Africans and indigenous, I think that would be one important way in which we could deconstruct it, to begin to realize that the organizations, or to think about fellow humans along the lines of, or organizing them along the lines of racial features, as something that is not desirable, but in fact problematic. That would be one way I could suggest readily to begin to deconstruct the doctrinal discovery.
I want to add to that, Nestor, that a part of the deconstruction is something that should be taken up. For myself as an educator, I'm at the tertiary level in a university context, but my thinking is all through levels of curriculum, beginning at preschool, elementary, middle, and high school. That there is work to be done there. I would like to be in dialogue, and I have found it to be very rewarding, in fact, to be in dialogue with other educators and communities about how the history of how we came to be here on this landscape and in these social relations to be something that we can really talk about and learn about in ways that challenge the kind of dominant narrative, of the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria sailing the ocean blue in 1492, those kinds of rhymes. They might seem like nursery rhymes, but they are part of a kind of grand narrative and story of origin and culture and way of being. So how are those things kind of disrupted for younger people? For me, learning about Estebanico and his role, in the Narvaez expedition in the early 1500s, I was amazed to learn of Africans from Portugal and Spain participating in these so-called exploratory voyages of the conquistadores. This was for me a disruption, and I was young. I was 14 or 15 or something like that, and it forever kind of changed my perspective. I'm sure other people have other kinds of stories about that. There was the other question on the floor about the 4 colors of the medicine wheel and challenges about racism because it names skin color or color in that way. I am not expert in that area. I think it's an interesting question that's raised. Intrinsically for me, I think we need to let indigenous perspectives and understandings, come to the forefront, to consult, to understand, and to understand also that modern conceptions and constructions of race, as controlling a narrative as they are not the only way of understanding, how humanity interacts with each other. So I hear the question, but I would like to consult more before responding in any definitive way. For me, the question that's raised is there is more than one way of thinking about these kinds of ideas about humanity and social interactions between different groups of people. And I will leave it there.
Wonderful, thank you. We have one final question that has slipped in. So I wonder if we can ask that last question, and then we will move on to our next 2 speakers. And this may be a question for you, Nestor. But the question is coming from Angelique. She asks, she's grateful for the heritage of the Spaniards and Portuguese in the history of racism in the Americas. The upcoming Quad Centennial in the USA in Jamestown, Virginia, originated with Angola, with the Portuguese. There was also a war in Angola with the Portuguese, but Africans were still taken and were supposed to go to Latin America, but the ship was intercepted by the English. So how do you see the connection between your conversation about Canada and that south of the border, or south of the USA?
Oh my goodness. Okay, so we don't have a lot of times, and these are the kinds of things that happened when we're doing something brief. There is no doubt that the story of slavery and imperialism cuts across right from the North Pole all the way to the South Pole in the Americas. And that the notion or that talking about anti-Black racism is something that impacts directly to every single nation in this continent. When I focus specifically on the Americas and the Spanish-speaking Americas and slavery, I do it particularly because oftentimes there is the notion that slavery in Latin America is something that didn't happen as much, or that for some reason in North America, Canada and the United States, slavery was more destructive, or it had a specific more specific characteristics. And it's what when I came, heard about, but didn't hear much about slavery in Latin America. So for me, learning to connect both Latin America and slavery in Latin America and slavery in Canada and the United States is crucial. And though Carol didn't say this, I'm going to say it, but she implied it. It's about unsanitizing our history and complicating it even further. And so there is no doubt that ships that were directed to Spain or to Nueva España, what today is Mexico, were intersected by the British. There is also no doubt that Cuba was one of the main ports of commerce for the purchasing of slaves for British and French also. So the interconnection is there. I think it's Paul Gilroy who calls it the transatlantic, who invites us to think about the slave trade as something cutting across the Atlantic Ocean, but having connections. Though he doesn't quite connect all of Latin America, I think it is important to see the African slavery as something that affects both sides of the border. As Carol has already emphasized, the expressions of the slavery were very different and they had very different intentions. But we cannot set aside the fact that entire populations from Senegal or from many places, Ghana, were divided, split, depending on who was the greatest, who was the kind of the highest bidder. So in that sense, I see it as interconnected, and that's part of the reason why I thought that it was appropriate for me to talk about the story, the side of the story of slavery in Latin America. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Nestor. And thank you to both you and Carol for this engaging conversation that we've been having so far. We will now turn our time and attention to the next two speakers. So we will next hear from Peter Noteboom. And Peter is going to be speaking about anti-Black racism, Afrophobia, and the Canadian Council of Churches, both challenges and opportunities. Peter is a member of the Christian Reformed Church in North America, and Peter also works as the General Secretary of the Canadian Council of Churches. So welcome to Peter.
Super. Thank you so much, Adele, and thank you, Carol and Nestor, for such a careful and learned and academic and lively presentation of the history and how we got here. Asfa, I just wanted to ask, how does it work to advance the slides along the way here? Is there a button that I click, or do you click that?
If you could say next, Peter, then Segma will advance your slides for you.
Perfect. So next. Great. So Adele invited me to share a few personal reflections and a few professional reflections and to name some challenges for churches in Canada. So I just wanted to start with a very brief thing about who the Canadian Council of Churches is, and then share a few things from my personal and then professional and then church perspective. So there's just a few slides here. This is a brief slide of who we are at the council. And in that first descriptive piece there about who the council is, I like the inclusion of affection for diversity. This is a brand new statement about who we think we are or how we would describe us. And that really comes from some work that was carried out already in the 1970s, at the time when thinking and acting about race in churches in Canada was also very at the forefront of the work of the Canadian Council of Churches in the late 60s and early 70s. All right, next. There's just a few numbers too about who we are, and I'm not going to stay there very long, but just to say that among the 10 program committees and subcommittees that are here at the council, it includes the Canadian Ecumenical Anti-Racism Network and the Forum for Intercultural Leadership and Learning. Both, I think, really real strong assets for this kind of work among churches in Canada. And of course, among those 200 member representatives that serve on the various committees, you know, we've had the benefit of at least 20 or 30 people working through Phil or through CERN that help to shape our sense of who we are and our work. On to the next one. So just a few things here from my personal background of how I came to this. When I was reflecting on Afrophobia, I thought, I think I know what that is. I remember growing up in a small college town. The first African Americans, I was in the state of Iowa. I remember the first ones that arrived to attend college in our town in the 1960s when I was very young, and I remember the family conversations about, well, that's the first time that people of a different color have arrived in our town. Who are they and what will they be like? And there was a good deal of fear of the other that was part of that conversation. So I remember that from my small town history on a personal basis. I spent 5 years in West Africa in the early 90s. Doing disaster response work in the context of civil conflict and some long-term community self-help work. And that gave me a real appreciation for the history and the accomplishments and the beauty of African peoples. I've always been interested in cultural history and philosophy of different kinds and found that to be an especially enriching time. When I came to Canada, I think it was an exercise that's sometimes called the race to the wall, but I did a little research for this presentation to try to remember or try to figure out where it actually came from. I guess it's called the level playing field exercise, or it was drawn actually from an earlier piece called the Horatio Alger exercise, but it's the one where you stand in a row with arms interlocked and questions are asked regarding your history or your experiences that include whether or not, for example, you were taught by someone of your own race, or whether or not you've been followed in a store as a shoplifter because of your race. And depending on the answer, you take a step forward or take a step backward. And of course, the interlocking arms were soon broken. And I ended up, of course, at the front of the room, and my close friend and colleague, Steve Kabetu, Kenyan Canadian, was at the back. I think the awareness from that anti-racism education exercise still fuels my own sense of outrage and injustice to that. I noted there down below too, buying a home. I did some thinking about that at the time, and it was clear that it was my own racial identity that made it possible for me to get a mortgage on a home that indeed has been the giver of many, many privileges of different kinds in my history here in Canada. There's another story to that, but anyway, that connection between my white identity and others who have a Black Canadian identity or another one, I have seen that play out in my personal life. Adele mentioned that I'm with the Christian Reformed Church, and 20 years ago I was together with a group of people designing an anti-racism workshop, and I learned again from my Steve Cabetu about the value. I think I was approaching it from a relatively technical problem to be solved, and he taught me to slow down and to listen and to pay attention to the relationships and the histories. So going through that process together with others with a different identity and background really helped me to uncover and to question my own, let me call them white proclivities or tendencies to go about fixing problems or to educate something away. He really taught me more about the importance of listening and relationships and history. That was a real important piece for me. In terms of the conceptual framework that I have brought to the work over the years, I guess most of it I learned from the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond in New Orleans, who I still feel, in terms of their passion and insightful analysis, offer so much to this work. All right, click forward next. Some professional reflections then here in the context of the Canadian Council of Churches. I started here maybe not quite 20 years ago, but it was in 2001 that the World Conference Against Racism was organized in Durban, South Africa. It was of course eclipsed by another event in September of 2001. But here at the Canadian Council of Churches, I've mentioned that there were a number of bits of work that were happening in the 60s and 70s and at other different times, but I think it really crystallized around the World Conference Against Racism, and that came out of, in the context of the Council, the Human Rights Committee and its work. And while there, the Ecumenical Caucus, and Adele Halliday was one of them, they drafted a statement, an ecumenical statement. And as I reread that, again in preparation for this, I just find that to be still a very moving and appropriate and sharp analysis of the situation around racism. And just the first 4 words of it have stuck with me ever since and often driven my own approach and educating around it in a church context, that racism is a sin. To name that and then to work from there in acknowledging that and moving beyond it. That group of people, there were 6 or 8 of those delegates, they were a gift. They came back with a great deal of unity and cohesion, and they have really, ever since then, driven much of the ecumenical work around anti-racism of different kinds. So one of the clear ways that happened was that they formed the Canadian Ecumenical Anti-Racism Network, which has been around since 2001 or 2002. Then several of the participants in that network are people who were still who went to that World Conference Against Racism. And they went through various stages along the way, which have all been, I think, helpful in shaping and forming the ecumenical anti-racism approaches here. And early on, there were several anti-racism education consultations with people from different groups. At a certain point, those sort of diminished in importance because people had made the connections. And folks wanted to go deeper into their own caucus or their own histories. So a white privilege group was set up, an African descendants group was set up, an Asian descendants group was set up, and an indigenous peoples group was set up. Out of that also came some work on theological principles for undoing racism, which I think are also still pretty good, and a series of resources and publications, including this one here, or one that I've got here on From Chains to Freedom and the Journey Toward Reconciliation, which was published around 2007, which was also the 200th anniversary of the law in Great Britain abolishing slavery. So along with CERN, the other big asset and area of work is the Intercultural Leadership and Learning Forum. And they have made a shift from focusing on global ministry to intercultural ministry, and now transforming that intercultural ministry through also the history of anti-racism work, of CERN in particular, but also keeping that edge to the intercultural ministry work. Next slide, please. Challenges for churches. I mentioned that resource on From Chains to Freedom, Journeying Towards Reconciliation. I think that the group of people who brought that forward and who published that and did the writing there, that was maybe in the last 20 years the most significant contribution of Black Canadians to the thinking and work around reconciliation and journeying toward reconciliation. I still return to that resource regularly for insight on that perspective. Of course, Adele Halliday has the first essay in it at the introduction, but also the work of Hazel Campaign there has also been pretty helpful and important for me. I would say that in the last number of years, the Truth and Reconciliation approach, the Indian residential schools, the calls to action arising out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, including the Doctrine of Discovery, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a framework for reconciliation, those have all really dominated the agenda, the ecumenical agenda of churches in Canada around race, racism, and intercultural ministry. And then the nexus of human rights, decolonization work, reparations, and reconciliation, there are so many interconnecting pieces there that that need and can use continued work. Many of the calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report suggest that bodies should all do cultural competency training, and so that's one thing that Phil actually does. In its programs too, it really helps bring forward the history of church and missions and identity in Canada, and offers more opportunity for reflection on how to understand that history, its relationship to power and privilege, and then working through that history and those stories into organizing for change. So those are a few sort of areas where churches have been challenged to take up the work. Next. I mentioned Hazel Campaign, who for me has been a guiding light on this work. And I went into her article on For Such a Time as This, the Demand for Reparations, to pick out a few of the bits of insight or words of wisdom that I find really helpful and a good guide for our work here. Hazel has a long history, Sister Hazel has a long history of work in many different areas. She still very engaged and brings a lot of personal experience to the struggle and to the work. But the parts here that I just wanted to highlight is that the reparations piece is important to think about, not just reconciliation, but also reparations, or not just privilege and discrimination and prejudice, but also reparations. And that reparations work is about repairing the damage at a deeper level than just the material level. So that obviously takes some thinking through about what that means and refers to, and some personal acknowledgement and repentance on the part of those who have inflicted that. She also mentions that reparations are the path that lead to reconciliation and transforming relationships, and names, of course, those steps that it's easy for us to skip on through them. I think it's easy for churches in particular to skip on through them without doing the careful step-by-step work and relationship building that needs to underlie each of them. And, you know, we've been helped already by Carol and Nestor in terms of truth-telling, but there's so much more on that side that still needs to be done. And so much of this work is recovering the complexity of the history. Next. The gospel is pretty clear about reparations and about the direction that's required of us. I'll just lift up the first one from Luke. Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, "Look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much." And then the one from Matthew. So when you're offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First, be reconciled to your brother and sister, and then come and offer your gift. I think that's it. I think that's the last slide there. Yeah. So thanks for the offer to make a contribution here. It's an honor to be with you all. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Peter, for sharing your reflections on anti-Black racism, Afrophobia, and the Canadian Council of Churches, both challenges and opportunities. This is very much appreciated. Our next speaker is going to be Kofi Hope, and Kofi will be presenting on the realities of Black youth in Toronto in schools, youth in the youth in the justice system and the workforce. And Kofi's roots are in the United Church of Canada. He's the former executive director for the CEE Center for Young Black Professionals in Toronto. And he's currently working with the University of Toronto addressing urban inequality with the university's Department of Geography and Urban Planning. So a warm welcome to Kofi.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Adele. And for the World Council of Churches for putting this on, and thank you to everyone who's listening today. So I'll get right into it. As has been mentioned, Black folks have been in Canada a long time, ever since this place really existed as a set of colonies created by settlers from Europe. Carol mentioned Jacques Cartier, and how when he came, Matthew da Costa, a person of African descent, was with him on the boat. And what I find so fascinating about that story is Matthew da Costa was able to communicate with the Indigenous people that they encountered here. And there's all kinds of questions on where he learned the language and how that happened. But following this, you know, we heard about the history of slavery in Canada. We also know about the United Empire Loyalists, those Black folks who fought on the side of the British during the American War of Independence, who then came up and settled in Canada. And of course, the history of the Underground Railroad, that kind of long history of Black folks being in this space, you know, before the loosening of race-based restrictions on our immigration system in the 1960s. And so, you know, one of the myths is that Black folks haven't been in Canada very long. We know that's not true. Another myth or perception that we hear out there is the idea that anti-Black racism, you know, is worse in the United States. And we always use this as kind of the mirror that we compare ourselves against to. And I would argue, and I don't have some of the stats today, that while in some places, you know, the material condition for Black folks on average may be worse in the United States, mainly due to the fact that there's a lack of a social safety net there to the same level we have, and things like universal health care. I would argue that social exclusion of Black folks in Canada is just as bad, if not worse, than it plays out in the United States. And there's different reasons for that, which we can talk about later. Partly there's also the historical reality that we don't have the same level of established national advocacy groups in Canada or the established Black middle class and specific Black middle class communities they have in the United States. But I think, you know, and I won't get into that, who has it worse off, but I would say that certainly issues of anti-Black racism are as prevalent in Canada as the United States. And there are some very worrisome trends. If we look at immigrants from Caribbean descent, we find that over time into the second and third generation, folks are progressively doing worse and worse off in Canada, which is opposite to the trend in the United States, and actually says that, you know, many times there was this common perception that Black folks were bringing their cultural issues from their countries of origin into Canada. But the stats actually show the longer Black folks are in country, in theory, the more Canadian they become. Actually, the higher their social exclusion is and the higher the barriers that they face in the school system and the workforce. I saw many of these things myself working in a nonprofit organization that served vulnerable youth in Toronto for 6.5 years. We focused on youth who were over 18, so 18 to 29, who were out of school, out of work, and facing significant barriers. These were youth who were full of brilliance and potential, but were truly struggling. Violence and conflict with the law tended to be consistent themes. Every year, we had instances of members themselves in our program dying of gun violence, or friends or family members or intimate partners being lost. You know, I think of one young man we lost in the program. He was in his mid-20s and had spent most of his adult life in jail. He'd been recently released, joined our program, and was just full of hope. He had a business idea, he had a plan for where he wanted to go, and I was with him about a week before he passed at a retreat that we did for our programming. And I remember it was, you know, 10:30 in the night, and him just keeping me awake, asking questions about this business. And I had to say, yo man, I just need to sleep. Don't worry, we appreciate, you know, the intensity. There'll be more time to talk about this. Unfortunately, there wasn't. He was killed quite publicly, shot over 9 times, left to pass in the street. A young man who was a child of God, a beautiful young man who was trying to turn his life around and build something for himself. Even more tragic in that story, he was one of 3 siblings, and all 3 of those siblings actually have passed of gun violence. So it's a family that had a history of conflict with the law, but no mother should lose all of her children, lose one child, let alone all of her children. And yet, this story is extreme, but is emblematic of the way in which Black youth and Black young men in the city of Toronto and in our nation find themselves in places of crisis and get caught up in the cycle of the drug trade and violence. In our programming, this, of course, was not the only issue we saw, but incarceration, solitary confinement were themes that came up. Young men talking about spending 3 months, sometimes 6 months in solitary confinement, turning 18 in a jail cell. You can imagine what that's like. And then just a variety of issues around homelessness, lack of stable housing, young women who were involved in being drug mules or human trafficking themselves. And we saw that these issues were intersectional, right? All the young people that we served faced barriers from being Black, but Black women, there were more complex barriers. Folks who were Black and queer, there were more complex barriers. Black and Muslim, these tended to add compounding barriers that people had to overcome. And within it, there was an overarching trend of trauma, both early childhood trauma and adult trauma. Many young people in our programming then were looking to mask this pain or to self-medicate through substance abuse. Now, the young people we worked with at SEA are not emblematic of all Black youth in this city. They represented a specific, highly vulnerable population. But on the other hand, many of the issues I spoke about, many of the stories we saw, you know, are kind of part of a larger crisis faced by Black youth in Toronto and are happening across the board. At the same time, what we saw in the programming is that when you surrounded these young people with a caring community, when you gave them opportunities to flourish, people took advantage of it, turned their lives around, and did amazing things. I was just at an event a few days ago and ran into a young woman we'd trained, and she was there working catering. She'd gone through our culinary program. She was working multiple jobs. When she came to us, she was suffering a variety of barriers, including living in a shelter. So with opportunity, Black youth can thrive and can reach all kinds of heights in the city. But we'll talk a little bit about some of the barriers they face on that journey. So who are Black Canadians? Black Canadian community is actually a small community. We're just 2.5% of the national population and about 4% of the population in the province of Ontario. There's nearly 1 million Black folks in Canada, and about half of that number, if not more, live in the GTA, and around 200,000 plus are in Montreal. So already, 7/10 of Black folks in the country are between Toronto and Montreal. And I'm going to speak in depth about Toronto because that's the context I know best, and in some ways might be the heart of Black Canada. In this city, Black folks are 9% of the population. We're the third biggest visible minority group, and the largest groups within the Black community. And that's the thing, we have Black communities, not one singular community. Within it, the largest group are folks of Jamaican descent, then Somali descent. You'd have people from the various islands of the Caribbean next, and then East and West African populations, and a much smaller Francophone and Latin American Black populations as well. Now, the fact that we are a smaller minority who have an impact and cultural influence, which goes well beyond our numbers, is part of why these issues continue to exist, because there's traditionally been the feeling from Canadians in Canada and Canadian politicians specifically that they can ignore the issues of the Black community, that we just don't have the political weight. Certainly a lot of work has been happening the last couple of years around this, but that has been the story up to the date. And because we've seen good levels of advocacy, we've seen a vibrant Black Lives Matter movement that's been keeping this issue in the media, we've actually seen some action. Last year, both the City of Toronto came up with the anti-Black racism strategy, and the province of Ontario came up with anti-Black racism strategies. So for the first time, we have governments in Canada naming anti-Black racism as an issue of importance. But we knew about this for a long time. In 1992, there was rioting on Yonge Street, the Yonge Street riots or Yonge Street uprising, however you want to classify it. And Stephen Lewis, who I think many of us in Canada would know, a former leader of the NDP and a great humanitarian, wrote a report about what had happened on Yonge Street. And I'll quote just briefly from it, because it's important to realize for how long these issues have been clear to policymakers. And he said, "It is the Black community which is the focus. It is Blacks who are being shot. It is Black youth that are unemployed in excessive numbers. It is Black students who are being inappropriately streamed in schools. It is Black kids who are disproportionately dropping out. It is housing within Black communities where there is a sense of vulnerability and disadvantage is most acute. It is Black employees, professional and non-professional, on whom the doors of upward equity slam shut. Just as the soothing balm of multiculturalism cannot mask racism, so racism cannot mask its primary target. Government initiatives must come soon, and they must be pretty fundamental." So that call for specific programs around who he saw as the primary victims of racism in Canada, Black folks, in 1992, we saw concentrated government action around that in 2017. Maybe better late than never. So what are some of those issues? And I'll just check my time. A few. We have poverty is a major one. We know that in Toronto, 41% of African Canadian children under the age of 15 live in low-income families, which is almost double that of all Toronto children. We know that the highest unemployment rate for any demographic in Toronto are Black youth, age 18 to 24, who in the City of Toronto have almost a 30% unemployment rate. We also know that the poorest demographic of any group in Toronto are single women of African descent who have children. And looking at some of the Toronto District School Board data, we see that 40% of Black students in the schools in Toronto today fall in the poorest socioeconomic bracket. The reality is material poverty is incredibly high for Black Canadians in Toronto. And then we have a school system that reinforces this. You can look at school suspensions and expulsions. Black students are 12% of the population in the school board, but are 31% of the suspensions. They're overrepresented in applied and non-academic classes. And because they're in non-academic classes, they have a much lower rate of applying to post-secondary and have double the dropout rate of Black students. I know someone who's a school board trustee. She makes sure to go to every meeting for expulsions that she can. And she reported that every single meeting she went to last year for someone who was potentially being expelled from school in the Toronto District School Board was Black. We see, I talked a little bit about the third generation issue. TDSB data is where that was able to be shown. It was Professor Carl James was able to highlight it, showing that in all populations, usually the second generation in Canada, they do quite well. They have that immigrant advantage of parents. And the third generation, there might be a slight drop. Unfortunately, with our Black communities of the third generation, the drop is significant. That something continues to be going wrong, or there are barriers that continue to emerge the longer Black folks are in Canada. And as I said, this isn't the trend in the United States. This is unique. What has this all led to? It's led to an 80% increase in the last 10 years of incarceration for Black folks. We know that in police carding, that issue of stopping people and searching them on the streets, that 25% of those searched in Toronto were Black Canadians, even though they're only 9% of the population. And we know that there is a reality of communities being over-policed. So it's not necessarily even that Black youth are committing more crimes than others, but in some communities, if you are, smoking weed, if you're getting in fights, if you're drinking underage, that's seen as, kids will be kids, boys will be boys in Rosedale or other upper income neighborhoods. And the chance that a police officer will stop you is quite low for that. In some communities, if you make a mistake as a young person, you will be stopped by police, you will be criminalized, and you will begin on a path that leads to further conflict with the law. A young man I was speaking to, we did an event with Olivia Chow and Jane and Finch. He spoke about a summer evening, this was a couple of years ago, where he was stopped 5 times walking from his building to the corner store, which is basically like living under police occupation. And as my friend Akwasi Osubempa, professor who does this work at U of T, speaks about, police crime statistics don't always tell us where the crime is. They usually tell us where police are choosing to pay attention. And certainly there has been over-attention in our Black communities, and of course abuse. We can think of Defonte Miller, the young man last year who was beaten almost to near blindness by 2 off-duty cops, and that case is still ongoing, along with the many Black men in the city who were killed by police, usually in the middle of mental health crises. This is part of the reality Black Torontonians and Black youth face. Discrimination in the workplace, and those simple, subtle microaggressions, walking by someone and they grab their purse, being followed through a store. These are the day-to-day pieces that continue to hold folks back. Though there are many promising bright lights in our community. I was just at a Black alumni event at the University of Toronto last week and seeing all the amazing things that have been achieved in law and medicine and science and politics. For so many Black youth in Toronto, they still continue to face incredibly entrenched barriers that stop them from reaching their full potential. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Kofi, for that excellent presentation. Thank you. Now is a time for, and just a reminder, Kofi was speaking about the realities of Black youth in Toronto schools, the youth justice system, and the workforce. So now is a time when we might have some time for questions for Kofi and for Peter. There's a few questions that have been asked in the chat. In terms of timing, we were scheduled to go just for another couple minutes, but I'm wondering if people are available, if you might be willing to stay for up to 10 more minutes so that we could respond to these last few questions. If that works for you, then that would be wonderful. So up to 10 minutes. One question that has appeared in the chat and continued in the chat came from Angelique. And that question just notes, this one is particularly for Peter, asking about reparations and noting that the biblical grounding is key to the conversation to mainstreaming church context, and that's very important. And how might the conversation be engaged with regional and continental general secretaries that are convened from the General Council, from the World Council of Churches? So, Peter, you've already started responding in the chat, but wonder if you might be willing to offer a few more insights for the whole group.
I don't know how much more I have to offer, but I just have noticed over the years that ecumenically in Canada and also international ecumenical efforts are sometimes helped by an occasion or an event, an anniversary that marks a particular important event. I'm thinking something like Sharpeville on March 21. Maybe there's an upcoming anniversary moment when it might be important for churches to get together and share where they're at on the journey. I wonder too about connecting it to to the pilgrimage for justice and peace. But when that becomes part of the commitments that churches make in their ecumenical relationships, and there's time to prepare the responses, then that can really help focus the mind and cross-fertilize and help people see a little deeper and a little further.
Wonderful. Thank you, Peter.
Just to quickly mention, it's also the UN Decade for Peoples of African Descent, and Canada just this year recognized it, so that also provides a mobilizing frame for these sorts of conversations.
Wonderful. Good. So there are a couple more conversations that have appeared in the chat. Kofi, this question may be for you. How might churches respond to some of the challenges facing Black communities in Toronto?
Yeah, and I think back to some of the activism I was doing in 2005 during the Summer of the Gun, and was kind of very much more connected to some of the on-the-ground life of the United Church in Toronto. I think there's a variety of ways, but the question is how do folks in the church do this as allies and in a framework of solidarity versus one of charity. And part of that, of course, is in order to really work as allies or solidarity, there need to be ongoing relationships. And so I think it's not to simply try to show up when there's a crisis, but to really put concentrated effort into how can the church be involved in the life of Black Torontonians, whether that's partnering with Black congregations on pieces or work that can be done in communities that predominantly have Black folks. I think as far as how to help, there's many Black serving organizations in the city that are under-resourced. When I did some work with the United Church, one of the things I said is the United Church has space en masse across Toronto. There are buildings, and some sort of agreement to help these groups that are doing essential work in the community have access to space is one of the best ways you can support the work that's happening. And I think also community ministries like my dear friend Barry Reeder, who's working in the Jane and Finch community, predominantly ministering to a Black working class community there. These community ministries are some of the most direct ways that the United Church is walking with Black youth and Black folks who are highly marginalized in the city. And we haven't been resourcing them to the level that we need to continue that work. Okay,
so there are several additional questions that have appeared in the chat. So I wonder if I might read all of them, and then we can decide among the speakers who might respond to them. So one question is noting that Kofi spoke about some of the characteristics and experiences of racism particular to Canada. So can any of the panelists say more about these characteristics and experiences and how these are barriers to or can be resources or opportunities for confronting anti-Black racism in Canada? So that's one question. A second question is how might churches respond to some of the how might the Canadian Council of Churches provide a context for this conversation, given that many churches have limited Black congregations? Third question, recognizing that race is a colonial construction and recognizing that one's skin color has a substantial effect on one's experience of living in Canada, how do we as church people work towards eliminating the racializations of people and still recognize, as Kofi said, who is being targeted? Two more questions, and then we can choose how we might go about these in the minutes left. So how do we need to challenge the prevailing sense that challenging anti-Black racism is still in reference to what the dominant culture will, quote, allow, and that what is normal is still seen in reference to how it is defined by white dominant culture and white privilege? How do we challenge the need to having to assert the inherent dignity in being Black? And the final question is, are there significant steps to redress the situation of youth in Toronto? Who are the dominant players who are helping to change the narrative? So that's a lot of questions, and we only have about 5 minutes left. So I wonder if maybe we can bring Peter, if you're able to turn your webcam back on and unmute yourselves when you're ready, then we can feel free to choose what questions you might be able to respond to in the time that we have left.
think it's better to hear from Kofi first. It'd be more valuable to hear your response to some of those questions. And then if there's time, I can respond to the specific CCC one.
Right. So big questions for 2 or 3 minutes to respond to. I think that these are all big ones. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the question that's there around in reference to the dominant culture is certainly one of the inherent issues, and that's the problem with many conversations about diversity within organizations. People tend to be very happy to add Black faces or other racialized faces into spaces, but the expectation is that those faces will simply act as if as the dominant culture already has. So there shouldn't be any change in the dominant culture or dominant organizations. Just, you know, come in, people of color. But that idea of inclusion and intercultural is where we get hung up on the details. How do we actually affirm that the way other people do things is all right and is blessed and may have, you know, incredible things that we can learn from? And that takes a great deal of humility, of recognizing that our dominant culture in North America is simply one tradition, and there's many within that as well. I won't try to say it's a homogenous majority culture, but that is simply one way of being, and we need to celebrate other ways of being, in whether it's the speakers we bring in, if it's in the church context, in the type of events, and whether it's making sure when people are at the table, we're truly listening to their views. I don't, you know, to me, it's more of an orientation of practice, of an openness, and for folks to really try to speak less and listen more. But it's also a recognition of the racism that exists in our context. You know, at United Church events, I've been called, you know, a credit to my race. The only time ever, I think, in Canada, a white person felt free enough to use the N-word multiple times in my presence was at a United Church event. And so these things are ingrained in the UCC as well. And so it's both finding opportunities to build real relationships with Black folks. You can't build empathy for a concept, you build empathy for people and through relationship. And also through doing some of that internal work to talk about things like white privilege and unpack it, I think it is part of this.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Kofi. I wonder if we could invite Carol and Nestor, if you're able to put your videos back on. Well, thank you. We're just in the last few minutes of our webinar, and so wanted to offer a thank you to everyone. So to Carol, to Nestor, to Kofi, and to Peter for your excellent presentations and engagement with the questions that we've had. Some of them were yes, they were excellent conversations, and in some ways this is a first conversation that may continue. This webinar is being offered in the context of the Church's commitment to the United Nations International Decade for People of African Descent, and Kofi had referenced that earlier in terms of Canada's commitment, and many of the churches have made commitments to engaging this decade as well, and this webinar is being offered in this context. In terms of what might happen next, after this webinar, the webinar link, the recording will be sent to everyone that we have an email address for. There'll also be an invitation to ask if people have additional feedback. If you think that it would be helpful to do this again another time with another related topic, you're welcome to offer those comments there as well. So perhaps in the last minute that's remaining, I'll give it back to the speakers to see if they would like to offer one final word before we close off our time.
I just have one comment, which is, first of all, thank you so much, Peter and Kofi, for your commentary, and to all who have offered questions and feedback so far. Thank you very much. I think the dialogue is furthered by engagement. I just wanted to say that I am of a viewpoint that as messy and as uncomfortable as some of these topics are, that it behooves us to engage in the discussion. It really does. I think we can further our dialogue and where we are as a society and in our various community contexts by having these kinds of discussions. And being able to sit with these topics and issues is really crucial. And also that I don't think that it's necessarily separate and apart. The idea that there's a Black history and a world history, that these are interconnected topics, and all of our discussion here today, from the personal reflections through to kind of macro perspectives on history, economy, and culture have shown that. So thank you so much for hosting this forum, Adele, and to the United Church, and to allow this discussion.
Thank you, Carol.
Will say, just to really echo Carol's comments, just a tiny little thing is, it is important that many of us people from different racialized communities not be engaged in a kind of competition of who has been more grieved or suffers more or is more of a victim. And this is something that Coffee emphasized, and I'm really grateful for that. It is important for us to see questions of racism as part of a larger complex network of issues that relate to colonization. And I think beginning to ask those questions, as Carol mentioned, but also frame them in the context of colonization might also help and shed light on our ability or inability to discuss those issues. So also thank you for the invitation. Thank you for my colleagues and their presentations. I'm really honored to be part of this.
Just a brief thing then from me. I responded to some of the questions in the chat box. Just really want to lift up the work of Jonathan Schmidt. And I also want to lift up the member churches of our council that are part of the diaspora. So the Ethiopian Orthodox Church in Canada, the Coptic Orthodox Church in Canada, the British Methodist Episcopal Church. Those are all churches with deep roots that go back to the African continent. And yeah, I'm interested in finding ways also to do that. They're also included not only Black communities in historic Protestant or Catholic churches. Thanks.
Yeah, I would thank everyone as well, and then my fellow speakers. I think the only thing I would leave to note is just the importance for the larger Canadian community to engage with, learn about the history and reality of Black peoples in Canada. Many times there's a feeling of being rendered invisible. Our history is not included in the history books. I know someone that came up from South Africa and went to the Canadian Museum of History in Ottawa and was quite surprised that there was no reference to slavery there in Canada and very little to Black Canadians beside a reference to Africville. And so many times our community, and even in the day-to-day realities with things like police carding that people have been speaking about for decades, and it wasn't until it was scientifically proven that people actually said, oh, this actually happens in Canada. And so that being rendered invisible or out of the conversation or being ignored is part of that systemic oppression. And part of it is recognizing we at least now are beginning to pay at least lip service to the importance of thinking about reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, but also including the struggles faced by African Canadians and the wonderful history there in our conversations. No longer rendering us invisible from the conversation is one of the steps towards really kind of undoing the historical wrongs and helping create a more prosperous Canada for our Black communities.
Excellent. So thank you once again to all of our speakers. Thank you as well to the World Council of Churches for also co-hosting this along with us. And thank you, SEGMA, in particular. This has been an important conversation. And again, the webinar recording will be made available. And it's our hope that these conversations may continue. So we'll give the last word over to SEGMA, and then we'll close off this webinar.
To everyone for participating in this webinar. A special thanks to our speakers who made time to join us in this very important and timely discussion. The recording of this webinar will be made available in a few days. You can access our previous webinars on racism and Afrophobia in our YouTube channel, the World Council of Churches YouTube channel. Just type WCC Afrophobia and you'll see the last webinar we did in February, and also the hearing on racism, discrimination, and Afrophobia we organized last year here in Geneva. Thank you very much. It's end of afternoon here in Switzerland, and I wish you all a very good day, and I hope we can connect again for another second part of this webinar. The conversation is so good, but time-wise we have to stop for today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, and have a good day.
Peace, everyone.